So if you do not know me, my name is Dawn Salerno. I'm the executive director here at the Roach Jones Duff House and Garden Museum. I always say here at because I am here. I'm not home. I'm not dialing in from California. I'm right here in New Bedford at 396 County Street. So we are open to the public. The house has been open since last summer. The gardens are blooming. The rose garden, not quite yet, but we expect those blooms very soon. So we hope you'll come visit us here at the RJD because there's always something different to see, honestly. I welcome you back. What I'm going to do once we get started, I'll just put a couple of links in the chat field, and that there'll be a link to our calendar of events, which is getting very busy next month. There'll be a link to donate to the museum, honestly, because we do so much programming for free or at a suggested donation. We always appreciate a donation of any kind and just kind of offset the programs like this and help us, keep presenting programs like this and digitizing them and putting them on YouTube. So I'll put those links in the chat, and I will also invite you to kind of put your future questions in the chat, or at the end of the talk, you may unmute and ask those questions live of our speaker. So for now, as I said, we'll appreciate you keeping your mics muted and your cameras muted if you don't mind while Peggy talks. So with that, thank you all for coming. I'm very excited to have Peggi Medeiros back with the RJD because she's been a speaker here since before I arrived. And I've been here 3 years now. She has often spoken at the RJD, and I started saying WAMSUTA because she is also involved in a lot of other local organizations. She writes, as she was saying earlier, she writes a newsletter for the WAMSUTA Club. She's been involved. She's helped out the City of New Bedford, the Waterfront Historical Area League, or WHALE, the Swain School of Design. She has written for the New Bedford Standard Times. And she's often a guest lecturer at the Dartmouth Historical Preservation Trust. And I think she could add 10 more things to that list. So, and I invite her to do that. She's also a published historian. So she's going to be talking to you a bit today about one of her books. And I will let her take it from here and take it away, Peggy.
Thank you. Thank everyone for coming. I appreciate it enormously. And I'm hoping we can have a fun early afternoon. I actually, when I was sitting down yesterday and going through and making notes on things I wanted to include to tell everyone about, I looked back in my first book, which was New Bedford Mansions, which is backwards because that's the way Zoom works. I guess I hadn't realized that, holding something up, but I was looking at what I wrote about RJD. And I found a very early glimpse of the house, and it was a glimpse that William Wallace Crapo, who was a congressman from Massachusetts, had when he was a little boy. And he told his father, Henry Howland Crapo, all about meeting William Roach Jr. at his new home. He talks about him being the great man of the town. And the little boy was terrified because he was going into a mansion. I mean, there weren't many mansions in New Bedford at the time of RJD. And to be a little boy expected to go in was kind of frightening. But he was shown into the back study, which I know the house talks about where that was exactly, and received with a cordiality which at once put him at his ease. William Roach Jr. at that time was 80 years old, but he talked to young William as if he were grown up, and he gave him a jackknife, which is quite wonderful. And it was a really snowy, cold day. So Mr. Roach said, "Well, I'm going into town. Come with me." And he tucked young William into his sleigh, and young William remembered the ride in the beautiful sleigh behind a spirited horse, and beside his distinguished host, long remained in his memory as one of his most wonderful experiences. And I love that particular piece because there aren't many exact looks at William Roach Jr. We know a lot about him. We know a lot about the house and how the house was built and how it was laid out, but there aren't many views of him as himself. And I thought it was wonderful that he was written about and remembered by the young boy who later became very important, very, very important. The Crapo family was one of those families in New Bedford that just was involved with just about everything. So in my first book, I divided New Bedford's mansions into families, and I wrote about the House of Roach, the House of Morgan, the House of Grinnell, because thinking about such a huge topic, that seemed like a good way to divide things up. And I did have one chapter in my first book about the House of Grinnell, which is terribly important because in my next book, the book that came out last March and promptly died because of COVID, is concerned with Joseph Grinnell. Most everyone knows vaguely that Joseph Grinnell was a congressman. Some people probably will talk to you about the Wamsutta Mill because he founded the Wamsutta Mill. And everyone of a certain age remembers when the Grinnell Mansion, which is sort of kitty corner from RJD up on the hill, was so endangered that just about everyone gave up on it. It had been sold by the Grinnell family to the Catholic Church, and it was a Catholic school. Unfortunately, they ripped out the staircase, so we have no idea what the staircase originally looked like because what was left was just this institutional building place. And it was a school for many years. In fact, one of my few favorite looks at it was when President Kennedy was getting ready to run for president the first time. He knew he had to run for his Senate seat was up, and he knew that if he was going to be taken seriously as a presidential candidate, he had to win his Senate seat big. So to do that, he spent a lot of time in Massachusetts, and he spent one entire day in New Bedford. With Jacqueline Kennedy came with him, and I found when I was researching it that all of the Catholic school students came out on the steps of the Grinnell Mansion and sang to him, because he began down at the Kennedy Center and then moved up and had lunch at the Wamsutta Club. But that's probably the only fond memory most of us have of what the Grinnell Mansion looks like. For years and years, we were positive it was going to be demolished because no one wanted to take it on. And no one could even think of what to do with it. I was lucky, and I'm not sure I was lucky enough. It was astonishingly bad condition. At one point, Mrs. Delano, who was the president of Whale, was trying to buy the mansion, and she invited a group of us to come in and see what was there. So we saw the rooms. There was no electricity at that point at all. Everyone had a flashlight with them. And we went through the house. And I don't remember being floored by the rooms, but I remember when we got to the attic, someone had obviously been living in the attic. There was a sleeping bag and things torn around. So if you had asked me to bet on a house in New Bedford, the mansion that would be saved, I would not have chosen the Grinnell Mansion. And that would have been a terrible tragedy. If anyone is curious enough and ever looks, there was a film made by Whale that's available on YouTube. And it was made in the 1990s, around 1990, 91, or possibly a little earlier, but the Grinnell Mansion has a star part in that film. And Peter Grinnell, who was the last Grinnell to live in the mansion, and who was a Whale board member, who many of us remember with great fondness, was filmed standing on the steps of the Grinnell Mansion and coming down. And in his voiceover, he talks about he always remembered the sound of those enormous doors banging shut. Sadly, he was not alive to see what happened with it, but the Grinnell Mansion was bought. It's now congregate living and it's taken care of beautifully. And that's only appropriate because Joseph Grinnell was an amazing man who plays a large part in my book, Harriet Jacobs in New Bedford. Russell Warren designed the Grinnell Mansion, and it's one of the, great New Bedford mansions. If you had to choose one after you choose the Rodman Mansion and RJD and probably the Wamsutta Club, the Grinnell Mansion would have been the house you chose. Joseph Grinnell was originally the founder of one of the great New York shipping companies, Grinnell and Minturn. He's important to our story because he adopted his niece, Cornelia Grinnell, when she was 5 years old. The Grinnell family had, sorry, my cat is making her entrance. The Grinnell family had many difficulties. They were a family of enormous gifts, enormous worth to New Bedford. But I was told by a member of the Grinnell family that there was a kind of depression that ran deep in male Grinnell members of the family, and any number of them committed suicide. And Joseph Grinnell's brother and Cornelia Grinnell's father committed suicide. He hung himself in the family barn and was found the next morning. So Joseph Grinnell decided that he would adopt Cornelia as his adopted daughter. There were older Grinnell children who were old enough to be well taken care of, but Cornelia was sort of left on her own. So Joseph Grinnell and his wife adopted Cornelia, and one of the first things they did, they began planning the new house on County Street, and they swept Cornelia up with an older sister and took them to Europe, which must have been amazing for a little girl to arrive in Europe, not really knowing anything about what she was going to see. And one of the most famous things in that trip while she was there was she was taken to visit an artist. And the artist was a sculptor who became eventually a very famous American sculptor who sculpted a bust of Cornelia. And at the same time, he was working with an older star journalist, Nathaniel Parker Willis, who was going to become eventually very important to our story. So that he had a bust also done, and it was done from the same block of marble, and no one thought anything much of it. The lovely thing now is if you go down to the Whaling Museum, you can see Cornelia's bust. And they also have the one of Parker Willis, but I don't think it's on display. As I mentioned, my book came out last March and promptly just died because everything that was planned for it was COVIDed out. So I got some copies and no one really knew the book could come out. I'd like to give you just a sense of the people who were most involved in the book. Harriet Jacobs, who was born in 1813 in Edenton, North Carolina, right on Albemarle Sound. Her parents were Elijah Knox and Delia Hornblow. She was an enslaved woman, and she had the rare gift of knowing her actual birth date, her parents and her brother John. Most slaves did not have that good fortune. In comparison, her friend from Rochester, New York, Frederick Douglass, did not know the date of his birth. He spent his entire life returning to Maryland, desperately trying to solve his puzzle, but he never did. And Douglass was never quite sure of who his father was. His father was a white man, but he was never able to get anything more specific. Cornelia Grinnell Willis was born in 1825 to Cornelius Grinnell Jr. and Eliza Talman Russell. And believe it or not, she was the youngest of 10 children, which is a lot of children. She didn't know at that time that her city was going to become the whaling capital of the world. There was a 12-year age difference between Harriet and Cornelia, but each girl suffered trauma in her childhood. Harriet, of course, the most obvious, of being enslaved and being enslaved by a master who was dangerous. Cornelia losing her father was also at an age where she was old enough to know what had happened to him. I should mention that Joseph Grinnell's first wife was Sarah Russell Grinnell. So that marriage united two great New Bedford families, the Russells and the Grinnells, together. Harriet actually had roots in New Bedford, Harriet Jacobs, that she didn't know about. And one of the great New Bedford stories that most people don't know about was members of what would become Harriet's family escaped to New Bedford. They escaped their master by ship. Their master, who was a rare piece of work, sent a slave catcher after him. And the slave catcher didn't know what he was getting involved with, because he went to see William Roach Jr. and asked for his slaves back. And William Roach Jr. said, no, I can't give you any information, and refused. And I love the story because it's the 6 members of Harriet, what would become Harriet's family, went to a number of places to keep them out of the hands of the slave catcher. They came to New Bedford, they went over to Rhode Island. There's one story that the slave catcher actually thought he knew where they were. And he went into a neighborhood and all of the neighbors surrounded him and said, leave. And he eventually did leave. The terrible thing about all of this is that a member of Harriet's family went back to being enslaved. Let's see. The most interesting thing about Harriet is that very few people know about Harriet Jacobs. I only learned about her and decided I had to write about her because my friend Carol Foster, I was volunteering with the Whaling Museum, and Carol was in charge of all of the books from the Merchants National Bank, which you may remember the bank donated them to the Whaling Museum. And we were working away and having lunch together as we did. And she said, there's a photograph. I'm convinced it's Harriet Jacobs. And I said, who's Harriet Jacobs? Well, I immediately found out who Harriet Jacobs is. The Whaling Museum owns a photograph that we can't prove. We think it's Harriet Jacobs with one of the Grinnell Willis children, but we can't prove it. And so I didn't put it into my book, but that started me. It's of a very youngish, late 30s Black woman holding a beautiful white baby. And we were both convinced that it was Harriet Jacobs. I immediately started learning about Harriet Jacobs and finding out everything I could just because I was vaguely interested. I didn't know when I started the connections with New Bedford and with Cornelia Grinnell Willis. And the relationship between Cornelia and Harriet and their children was, and still is, an amazing one to me, because they were friends throughout life from the moment they met, and they took care of each other through sickness and health and everything else, and nursed each other when they were dying. It was a kind of friendship that you don't often find any longer. And I was thrilled to find out about Harriet and Cornelia. You have to excuse my cat. She is very fond of my desk when I'm doing things. So Cornelia, when they came back from Europe, immediately moved into the house that we now know as the Grinnell Mansion. Joseph, at that point, Joseph Grinnell was 41 years old. He was the second eldest of all of the Grinnell brothers, and they decided collectively that he was the one who could come back to New Bedford care for Cornelia and run into business there. I mentioned the sculptor in Florence, Italy, who was Horatio Grinnell, who was very well known at the time. He was kind of the best known sculptor in America. He was based in Florence, and he did both Cornelia and her future husband-to-be, Nathaniel Parker Willis. And there are a number of statues that he did that are in Washington, D.C. If you ever go to Washington, you can find the Grinnell marbles that are quite wonderful. Joseph Grinnell gave Grinnell $100 for the statue, and then another $100 when it was finished and it was sent to America. So it was a fairly expensive piece of work, which stayed in Cornelia's family for a very long time and was eventually given by the family to the New Bedford Whaling Museum, which was something I was very fond of, and I've seen it. Every time I go into the museum, I stop to see it. I should mention, and I will, he's not quite the hero of our story, but Nathaniel Parker Willis was America's version of Charles Dickens. He was extremely famous. I'm trying to think of a writer with a kind of fame. Maybe Stephen King is as well-known a figure as Nathaniel Parker Willis was in the 19th century. Willis was the kind of man who, if he went on a trip to Europe, all of the newspapers would note that he had sailed, who he'd sailed with and where he was going and what he was going to do. And he actually met Harriet first. Harriet had what was one of the most extraordinary teenage young girl lives you can possibly imagine. She had her master was determined to seduce her. She was determined she would not. She had 2 children by a white man and then disappeared, and no one knew what had happened to Harriet. The thought was that she may have, run north, but if she'd run north, she wouldn't have left her baby. She had a daughter and a son. What Harriet did was to keep away from her master, who would not leave her alone, who would beat her and just treat her horrifically. She went into hiding. She hid in her grandmother's attic for 7 years. If you can imagine, 7 years in an attic. She couldn't really stand up or do anything but sit or lie in this space. She could barely walk because it was so tiny. She could only see her son and her daughter outside the window. And she did it for 7 years to keep away from this absolutely dreadful man. His name was Dr. Norcomb. He, in addition to being absolutely disgusting, he was a morphine addict, which did not help things at all. So basically, Harriet spent all of those years in the attic seeing no one. Eventually, her grandmother sent first her daughter went to stay with her. I should mention their father was a United States congressman who spent most of his time in Washington. So she sent her daughter her grandmother sent her daughter to stay with him. Then shortly thereafter, they snuck the boy out and sent him north. So both of Harriet's children were safe, and it was safe then for Harriet to run. And Harriet, after 7 years, did run, and she ran north. And she was looking for some way to live. And she became the nursemaid for Nathaniel Parker Willis's daughter. Nathaniel Parker Willis, at this point, as I mentioned, was extremely famous as a writer. Dickens really was the closest example of the kind of writer that Parker Willis was. I'm convinced that someday there's going to be a revival on Nathaniel Parker Willis, because he did write very well and he could write very funny commentary. And he'd become famous by going on trips to Europe and England and writing sort of journals home, discovering all of his adventures. While he was visiting in England, he married a woman named Mary Stace, who was the daughter of a military man, and brought her back to the United States. She was the first Mrs. Willis. She had the couple's first child, Imogen, and they were looking for someone to take care of Imogen, and they found Harriet. And Harriet at first was very leery about especially telling Mary Stace anything. Eventually she broke down and she gave her the story of where she came from, what she'd been doing, why she was in the North. And Mary Stace was so fond of Harriet, she immediately got a lawyer and checked to see what would be the best way of protecting her. And happily, at the same time, Harriet saw her daughter Louisa again, and her young son, who had been in New Bedford. Why they chose New Bedford, the only thing I can think of is that there were family stories about William Roach Jr. and the family members who had been in New Bedford, because he came to New Bedford and he tried to teach himself to read and write, and he decided that wasn't working. So he went out on a whaling voyage, and while he was on the voyage, had the time, how I have no idea, to teach himself to read and write. He heard that Harriet, when he came back from one of his trips, he and Harriet were united and had the chance to be together again. These were probably some of the happiest years of Harriet's life. She was very fond of the Staces. She was very suspicious of Nathaniel Parker Willis. I think because Willis was such a star and a prima donna, and I don't think she trusted him fully. He never gave her a reason not to trust him, but she didn't trust him at all, which is one of those things that happened. And eventually, sadly, Mary Stace died, and Nathaniel Parker Willis was left with his daughter Imogen, and he convinced. At that point, Harriet had been very happily, had left the family and was living in Cambridge with her son and her daughter, and it was very happy. But Parker Willis begged her to come back to take care of Imogen, who she had loved, and to go with them to England. And so Harriet Jacobs, along with Nathaniel Parker Willis and little Imogen, set sail for England. Their trip away was actually noted in one of the newspapers that noted that Mr. Willis, who's recently widowed, has returned to England. The reason the story is important is that when Harriet was in England, she was welcomed and taken care of. And she also began attending church services. And she felt that she was saved by attending those services. She loved being in England, but of course had to go back because of her children. If you can believe this unbelievable story, there was a second Mrs. Willis, and the second Mrs. Willis is our Cornelia Grinnell Willis. And when she had the chance to meet Harriet, the two of them immediately formed a very strong bond. They meant the world to each other. Harriet nursed Cornelia when she was ill after childbirth. It was the kind of friendship that maybe is 19th century, but it was one that lasted forever. Eventually, we don't know, we assume that Parker Willis knew that she was, that Harriet was a fugitive, because Cornelia did tell him. She spent lots of time in New Bedford, actually, in summers, In 1851, the entire family spent the summer in New Bedford, living in the Grinnell Mansion with all of the Willis children. So it's wonderful that there's this close connection between Harriet and New Bedford, which really hasn't been thought of before or written about, but I think it's wonderful. And Harriet, of course, later would write the very first and only autobiography of an enslaved woman that we know of. And in her book, she wrote about New Bedford and about New York. I seldom ventured into the streets, and when it was necessary to do an errand for Mrs. Willis or any of the children, I went as much as possible through back streets and byways. I lived in a state of anxiety. When I took the children out to breathe the air, I closely observed the countenance of all I met. I dreaded the approach of summer when snakes and slaveholders made their appearance. I was, in fact, a slave in New York, as subject to slave laws as I had been in the slave state. Strange incongruity in a state called free. She was absolutely right. In the summer, slave catchers would make a habit of coming north and attempting to find people to take back into slavery. We know that Harriet's slave master never stopped looking for her. He would run notices in newspapers describing her and asking for any information. If you have seen this woman, please turn her in. Norcomb there's really nothing good to be said about Norcomb. He didn't come himself, he just would hire these slave catchers and send them. And at one point, when Harriet and Cornelia learned that the slave catcher was in New York looking for her, they had to decide what to do. And the decision they made was to send Cornelia to send Harriet to New Bedford, to the Grinnell Mansion. And she had Harriet bring with her the youngest Willis baby. And the reason that Harriet did that or agreed was that Cornelia said, basically, if you are caught, the only way we will know that you're caught is because of the baby, because it'll be written about. So she took the baby, we think it was one of the youngest boys, and came to New Bedford and hid in the Grinnell Mansion. In the meantime, Cornelia met with the slave owners and in effect paid them off, bought Harriet's freedom. Harriet, when she heard about it, was upset and delighted at the same time. She felt that, buying her freedom was wonderful, but it was also a terrible thing that it had to be bought. And as the story went on, as I mentioned, we have the group together. Someone suggested to Harriet that she should write a book about her life because people should know about what she had. So she wrote it in two places. One was the New York upriver estate that Nathaniel Parker Willis built using Cornelia's dowry. He was always a bit short of money. And the other place she wrote was in New Bedford in the Grinnell Mansion. In the summers, they would bring the children here because it was to be with the Grinnell grandparents. And so Harriet worked on her book here. She was determined to not tell Nathaniel Parker Willis what she was doing. And she managed to keep the book a secret from him, although Cornelia knew all about it. When it first came out, actually, Harriet had bad luck with writing. She wrote it just before the Civil War broke out, so that all of the reviews kind of died. The book was originally called Linda, because it was published anonymously. And it actually got wonderful reviews. In 1861, on April 13th, the Weekly Anglo-American wrote, "In this volume, a woman tells in words of fire, yet never overstepping the bounds of the truest purity, not how she was scourged and maimed, but that far more terrible sufferings were endured by and inflicted upon women by a system which legalizes concubinage and offers a permanent premium to licentiousness. No one can read these pages without a feeling of horror and a stronger determination arising in them to tear down the cursed system which makes such records possible. Obviously, all of the great reviews came from the North, not from the South. Harriet actually made a trip to England trying to bring the book out there, but it didn't work out. She was, it was edited by a then very famous feminist, Lydia Maria Child, who thought that the book was just brilliant and was determined to make it receive publication and to get it read. And one of the things she did, which I thought was wonderful, was that she wrote to, of all people in New Bedford, Daniel Ricketson, and said, you know, my friend has just written this brilliant book. Can you do anything? Can you sell some copies? And Ricketson, who was supposedly shy as a groundhog, not sure about that, but I always thought it was a rather good way of describing him, wrote back and said, well, he would love to read the book, but he wasn't sure he could do much about selling it. But it did come out. It did receive some recognition, a fair amount of recognition before the war. During the war, Nathaniel Parker Willis, although he was in very bad health, went to Washington and became a wartime correspondent and a friend of all people, Mary Lincoln. And we have letters, little notes that Mary Lincoln wrote to Willis teasing him, which kind of helps to humanize her. And Willis was a very good writer, so he was able to really grab people's attention. During that same period, Harriet went to Washington with her daughter Louisa, and they began working with the enslaved people who would run free. When the war broke out and when it reached Virginia, thousands of slaves fled behind the lines and came to Washington, D.C. And Harriet and Louisa worked with them, you know, finding them clothes, getting them food, setting up a school for them. And at that time, she really didn't see very much of Willis or of Cornelia. But there is one note during the middle of the war. Willis wrote to someone who was renting their place on the Hudson and said, my dear family friend Harriet Jacobs is coming north and would like to see the house. Will you please show it to her? She hadn't seen it in a number of years. So Willis was not quite as bad or as awful as you would think he would be. He made it through the Civil War, but he'd been having seizures. He apparently had a form of epilepsy, which was quite dreadful, and he needed a lot of nursing. And Harriet, of course, came and nursed him. I should mention, Willis was a magazine publisher. And in addition to being the sort of Dickens also had a magazine. Just about everyone in America knew about Willis and his magazine. It was epilepsy, and it was quite dreadful. He was ill for the last 6 or 7 months of his life. And Willis was very sensitive about people knowing that he had epilepsy. He was afraid that people wouldn't understand him, but he was watched and cared for by his wife and faithful Harriet, and no strange hand ministered to him or marked his failing consciousness. He died on the afternoon of the 20th of January in 1867, his 61st birthday, so he was very young, so that no single watcher could not say one. It was so quiet. He's buried at Mount Auburn Cemetery, and he was in the Episcopal Church. And his pallbearers were an impressive list of New England people: Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Charles Henry Dana, Holmes, Lowell, Fields, Edward Quincy. All of the 19th century New England writers came to pay their respects to him. Harriet, of course, came to Willis as he was dying, and she had promised she would stay with him. In the meantime, the Willis's children had begun growing up. Grinnell Willis was 19 years old, Lillian was 17, Edith was 14, and Bailey, the very youngest, was 10. So Cornelia spent most of her time taking care of the children and bringing them up. And at one point she took them to Europe so that they would get a sense of what the world was like. Bailey eventually studied in Germany, and he became a geologist, and he became one of America's most famous geologists. First, he worked in Washington and worked on geological surveys, and eventually he settled in California at the University of California at Berkeley, which has all of his papers. And I'm very fond of them because when I was writing my book, I was desperate to find a photograph of Cornelia Grinnell. The only photograph that I had ever seen is absolutely dreadful photograph of her as an elderly woman hunched in a chair, looking alone. However, the Huntington Library, I was led to, had a photograph of Cornelia, which I can show you. Unfortunately, we can't see her face, but it is Cornelia, and it is a much better photograph than that dreadful one of her as a sad little old lady. In the meantime, Louisa and her mother went back to Eddington, North Carolina to try to recover her grandmother's home, which didn't work. She wasn't able to do it. She never quite forgave the South for being such a terrible place and for treating her family so badly. Harriet became very frail, and Cornelia tried to raise funds for her. Of course, Cornelia paid for a surgeon and doctors and medications, and Bailey and his wife were able to visit Harriet and Louisa. So Cornelia was absolutely determined that Harriet and Louisa would stay in their homes, that they would not have to leave. And they didn't. And what's quite wonderful is that eventually, after Harriet's death, she was recognized across the country. She lived until 1897. And the Boston Herald, which at that point was a very impressive newspaper. If you've seen any of the old Boston Heralds, there's absolutely no relationship to the current Boston Herald we have today. It noted, a woman died in Washington on Wednesday, whose early career was as romantic as ever that has been written. She was born a slave 82 years ago, and while in her 20th year, escaped to the North amid terrible experiences and hardships. Goes on about New York, N.P. Willis, evading her masters, and her visits to England. She had meanwhile written a touching little story of her life, relating therein one of the most painful histories of the well-born mulatto slave of the South and her efforts to escape from bondage. But a little later, she not only gained complete freedom for herself, but for her children, who were then being educated in the North. And the Springfield Republican wrote about her. And I think it's wonderful that Harriet did receive some sort of recognition. Her book never died. It always remained in print, and people always read it. Louisa was absolutely beautiful. She was courted by any number of people. At one time, Harriet and Louisa ran a boarding house in Cambridge for Harvard University students and professors, which I think is wonderful. And the problem was that the professors kept trying to court Louisa, and Louisa said no, she would not marry. because she was Black. She was just determined not to marry into any families, and she never did marry. She was, however, taken care of by, well, she earned her own money, but she also was looked after by the children, by Cornelia's children. And I should mention that Harriet is also buried at Mount Auburn Cemetery. So if you ever want to go and visit Parker Willis, you can also visit Harriet because she's there. And Harriet brought her, came north at that point. She was staying with Edith Grinnell in Longwood. Edith never married, and the two kept house together and were great friends, and decided to stay with Edith and not go back to Washington. She would occasionally visit New Bedford fairly often. Cornelia Grinnell Willis also lived alternately in Washington and New Bedford. Bailey was in Washington. Grinnell was in New Jersey, and Grinnell was an amazing businessman, and he funded and paid for a New Jersey library that still remembers him. When I was writing the book, I contacted them for information, and they said, "Oh, we know all about Grinnell Willis." None of it was particularly helpful, but it was fascinating to know that he was remembered by them. And I'm just checking to see if there's anything else I want to make sure that I get to talk about. Louisa, when she was very ill, made a will, and she left most of her money to Edith Grinnell and a little bit to Edith's sister Lillian. But there had been a New Bedford family of relatives who had not returned to Edenton, North Carolina, and who stayed in New Bedford. And at some point, and I was not able to find exactly when, they were members of the Knox family, William and Elijah Knox of New Bedford, and she left them money. And she also left, money for her friends in Washington. So this is basically the story of two families that lived together, loved each other, cared for each other. And one thing I had to mention is about Imogen Willis, who became a member of the women at the Harvard Observatory. She was one of the Edward Charles Pickering, who was in charge of the Harvard Observatory, hired women to work in the observatory. And Smithsonian Magazine even wrote about it. So began an era in Harvard Observatory history where women, more than 80 during Pickering's tenure from 1877 to his death in 1919, worked for the director computing and cataloging data. Some of these women would produce significant work on their own. Some would earn more than a certain level of fame among founders and female scientists. It's quite wonderful. Imogen already had known a little bit about astronomy when she went to Harvard, and she had measured stellar photographs for the Gould's Conservatory Coastal Survey. Louisa lived until 1917. And when she died, William Boyd, who had married one of the other girls, Parker Willis girls, wrote, "Yesterday morning early, Louisa Jacobs died at Edith Grinnell's after a long and most trying illness. She was about 80. Her life has been one of the great tragedies. I wrote much of it in this journal in 1905, if I remember the year, and it was well worth reading. I got it all directly from Mrs. N.P. Willis, my mother-in-law, and Louisa's friend and benefactor through life. Louisa was as white as any white woman, without a sign of the Negro in her, with education and charm, and in her youth great attractiveness. She had great intelligence, a rare fancy and imagination, and a way of expressing herself that was quaintly and delightfully her own." It's amazing because Boyd was definitely not an attractive man. The fact that he understood and cared about Louisa is astonishing. I find it astonishing anyway. I've read his diary, and he was a very self-centered man. He was terrible to his Grinnell wife. But that, in probably too long a session, is the story of Harriet Jacobs. And if anyone has questions, I would love to answer them and talk about Harriet and Nathaniel Parker Willis and the